Welcome back to Micro-Digressions. This is Spencer Case, as usual, and I'm here again with Travis Timmerman. Travis, how are you doing?
I'm doing well. How are you?
Quite well, quite well. Travis is the co-editor of this volume, Exploring the Philosophy of Death and Dying, with Michael Cholby. And we were talking about this in January and decided we'd pick it up in a couple months and finish our discussion of death and dying. So in the first conversation, we talked about whether it's possible for something to be neither dead nor alive. We talked about the deprivation view of the harmfulness of death and the Epicurean view that death is not a harm, and a whole variety of things. I recommend you check it out, but I don't think it's a prerequisite for the conversation we're about to have. They're complementary, but you could start up here, I think, and it would work just as well. Does that sound right to you, Travis?
Yeah, absolutely.
All
but
right.
You should listen to both repeatedly.
You should listen to both.
And buy that book, many copies of it.
That's right. Give one to all of your friends.
And enemies.
And enemies. I actually live right next to a funeral home, and I feel like maybe I shouldn't laugh at this, but it's called Dunn Funeral Home, like D-U-N-N. And I can't help think, but like that seems a little on the nose, like done. And I saw an advertisement for them. Their motto, I guess, is your family, your community, your funeral home. And I thought that could be improved upon.
Yeah.
Your family, your community, you're down for the count.
Yes, you should suggest that to them. It'd probably draw business from people that have a nice, dark sense of humor, like I do.
So, brief recap on deprivationism. Deprivationism is the view that death is a harm for the subject, for the person who dies, because it deprives that person future benefits. Right? If you're dead, you're not enjoying good experiences and what other goods you might think add to your well-being. So, but that wouldn't make death inherently worse than being in a coma or something like that. Whereas there's this other view, annihilationism, that I think David Benatar has promoted as an alternative to the deprivation account, and then you have criticized this. So why don't you run us through like what annihilationism is and your critique of that view?
Yeah, sure. I'll just add actually one more thing about deprivationism to Steelman Benatar's view as much as possible. Right? So the deprivation view says death can be bad for the person that dies, and whether it is depends on the extent to which their death deprives them of additional net good life. Not all people's death are bad for them, according to the view. And you might think that there's something surprising or objectionable about that. And I think this is partly what motivates David's acceptance of the annihilation view. So if you imagine somebody who is terminally ill and doesn't have any perspective of good life in the future, but wants to continue living, longs for more life, even though they can't get it. On some ways of understanding the deprivation view, their death was not bad for them at all, or maybe even good for them, because had they not died when they did, they might have just suffered a little bit more and then died a short time later. And you might think, no, there's something like terrible about that person's death. And the annihilation view is supposed to help vindicate that judgment to some degree. So rather than saying that death is merely extrinsically bad, as the deprivation view does, the annihilation view says death is bad for the person that dies over and above the deprivation badness. So in a sense, it agrees that the deprivationist is identifying one part of the harmfulness of death, the extrinsic value that's lost. But then saying there's something else that is just bad for a person to die. The way that Benatar understands it, it really is a person. So if you're a non-human animal that lacks personhood, say like a chicken, then he thinks annihilation's not bad for a chicken. If you're a like late stage fetus or newborn baby, let's say, that doesn't have personhood in Singer's sense, Benatar would think annihilation's not bad for them. The deprivational harm is there, but the annihilation's not bad. There's something about being a person that's having your existence ended that's bad over and above the supposed deprivational harm. What can be said in favor of that is it's supposed to account for the judgments about death being bad, even in cases in which persons have no prospective life. He thinks it can explain away the judgment that the deprivationist is committed to, that generally the worst time to die is the moment you come into existence. Because Benatar thinks like death is worse for an adult person, or say a teenager, than it is for a newborn baby. And part of the explanation for that is, well, the teenager has the annihilation harm on top of the deprivational harm, and the baby does not. And he thinks it can explain the asymmetry problem. People seem to think the deprivation at the end of their life brought about by death could be bad for them. But it's not bad for them to be deprived of existence before they were born. It's not bad for them to not have been born earlier, when they would have had a longer, better life as a result. So Benatar thinks it can do this sort of explanatory work, and that's why we should accept that it's bad in and of itself.
I was going to say maybe one thing that the deprivationists can say to diffuse some of those intuitions, like the intuition that it seems worse to die when you're 13 years old, say, than a baby. It seems more tragic. I think we can explain that away. Someone who loses a young child, not a newborn or a fetus, but like a child of 10 or 12 or something, is going to be lamented a lot more. It's going to be more impactful. And we also have a more vivid awareness of what that person's life would have been like, right? Because she'd already have lived some of it. And so it's easier to imagine that going forward. And so I think it gives us, we have a more vivid impression of what the loss would be. And so I think that maybe helps diffuse the anti-deprivationist intuition here, right? We can sort of give an error theory for that intuition. I think that's good enough.
Yeah, I completely agree with that. And I think it's worth bearing in mind that these are just supposed to be views about the prudential value of the event of death. And that's a different question, as your comment points out, from how maybe tragic a death is, how lamentable it is, or what sorts of attitudes are warranted in response to various deaths. And it's a different question from the moral reasons that we'd have to prevent various deaths. So the death of a very young tortoise, for instance, might be worse for the tortoise, according to deprivationism, than the death of an older adult person that doesn't have many years of good life left. But that doesn't mean necessarily, maybe you should, but it doesn't follow deductively from that from the commitment of deprivationism that say you'd be obligated to save the turtle over the human in this case. And it doesn't follow from this judgment about deprivationism that it's more tragic to die the moment you come into existence than to die as a teenager. It doesn't follow deductively that you should care more about the death of a fetus or a baby than that of a teenager. I mean, maybe you should, but you can't move from this commitment of deprivationism to those judgments. And I think once we see how those things can be separated, the intuitive pool of those judgments that Benatar points to are severely diminished.
Maybe he can still say, but you complicate the theory a little bit, because you'd have to add something to it to get some of those intuitive judgments. Like it seems like it's a rather straightforward account of tragedy to say that, well, the more harmful thing is like the more tragic thing, or something like that, or the events that we should most want to prevent are the more harmful events. So I mean, I think you'd have to add some like deontic bells and whistles to get all of the intuitions that maybe Benatar is trying to draw attention to. So although it doesn't deductively follow, I think like there might be some bullet biting involved. What do you think?
Yeah, I don't think quite right. So one reason has to do with the funny feature of the deprivation view, which is that death is merely extrinsically bad. So even if you were the most simple-minded utilitarian, maximizing utility could often require preventing a death that's it could require preventing a death that's less bad. But the other thing is adding on I mean, I don't know if I'd call them deontic judgments, but you to your point, you would have to accept additional claims about morality and the relationship between morality, prudence, and fitting attitudes. I think that's true. I mean, but since this is only a view about prudence, I just don't see how that could be avoided, right? So, I mean, maybe there's a way that Benatar thinks his annihilation view could offer a simpler connection to issues of like prudence and the connections between prudence, morality, and fitting attitudes. And that might be, but it wouldn't be as simple, I think, as he would want it to be. There's a presumption on philosophy to like not mention Hitler, but I don't get the, reason to not go to Hitler examples all the time. I'm happy for liberal use of Hitler examples. So like Hitler's suicide could be very bad for him insofar as it prevented him from living an additional good life. But like clearly that's less lamentable, I think, than much less deprivationally bad deaths of people who are not evil. And that's already drawing a distinction between how prudentially good or bad some event is for the person that died and what sorts of attitudes are fitting to have towards it. And then of course I'd want to appeal to the difference between preventing the deaths of evil people and non-evil people as a moral difference, that we could have more moral reason to prevent the deaths of good people, even if they're far less bad, than much worse deaths of evil people. In fact, fitting attitudes might require feeling good about the deaths of bad people and feeling bad about the deaths of good people. So, I mean, that's just a long way of saying I think it is going to get more complicated once we bring in these other judgments, but we're going to have to draw some connection between these different domains. And it's not obvious that this one is needlessly complicated or complicated in a way where considerations of parsimony should make us antecedently skeptical or something of what the deprivationist has to say.
Okay, so let's now hear your critique. Actually, I saw you present on this, and like the argument was too good for it to make a good session at Rome when you presented. It was like Timmerman versus Benatar. This is going to be great. And then you gave your argument, and it's like, oh, it's over. It's like I paid for a heavyweight fight, and it was over in one punch, and I want a refund now. That's kind of how I felt. It was a brilliant argument and like a terrible session. So let's go ahead and hear your argument.
Well, that's very nice of you to say. I didn't convince David, and I that hasn't been published yet. It's going to come out as a chapter in a book that I'm working on, The Badness of Death. So we'll see if other people are as receptive to it as you. I hope so, but I'm not. I'm not holding my breath. Okay, so let me preface this with I think one overlooked benefit of the deprivation view is that it can preserve judgments about when it is prudentially valuable for a person to die. And an insightful feature of that view is it preserves the connection between how overall good or bad the event of death is and the prudential reason that somebody has to seek or avoid it. The annihilation view is actually a bit ambiguous, but however you work it out, if it's going to do the work that David wants it to do, it's going to have to sever that link. And I think that is a problem for the view. Now, to help illustrate that via a slightly different point, I think it's worth thinking about a first order case. I find thinking about cases helpful. So if annihilation is bad in itself, over and above the deprivational bad, then I would first want to know how bad is it? And then however David or the annihilationist answers that question, then we can start thinking about trade-off cases. So you tell me how bad it is to be annihilated. And then I'll give a case where you can avoid annihilation by incurring a lesser bad. And just as a matter of prudence, if you can do option A with a greater bad or option B that's a lesser bad and all else is equal, the prudent thing to do is to do the option that has a lesser bad. Okay. Now the thought is, if annihilation is intrinsically bad, it's going to generate, I think, clearly absurd verdicts when we start thinking about trade-off cases. Here's the type of case I have in mind. Suppose Diego has cancer, and the cancer is going to kill him if you don't intervene, and if he's killed, he's going to be annihilated. Now, he can avoid annihilation and live a life that has no well-being. So it'll be new. And there's lots of ways to cash that out, and it depends on what is actually required to be annihilated. But I mean, one way to do it is Diego is put into a consciousless coma I don't think that results in his annihilation for eternity. So he accrues no intrinsic goods or bads. He just exists forever with a well-being level of 0. Or if you think that involves annihilation, then suppose that he's cryogenically frozen for eternity and accrues no intrinsic goods or bads. If you think that involves annihilation, then suppose that he continues to exist, but where the goods and bads perfectly balance each other out. However you want to weight them so that they perfectly balance each other out, then he exists with the well-being level of 0. So the point is, he would avoid annihilation but get no additional good life. If annihilation is bad, then he should be willing prudentially to incur some bad, less bad than the annihilation, to avoid the badness of annihilation itself. So, tell me if it's worth a day of torture, and then I'll set up the case so that Diego can, rather than dying from cancer, be tortured for a day and then cryogenically frozen forever. And then that would be better for him on the annihilation view. I think that's absurd. Or he could be tortured for a day and then put into a consciousless coma for eternity rather than dying. So he still exists. He avoids annihilation. I think that's absurd. Or he's tortured for a day and then he lives a life where he's conscious, but he has no net good, period. I think that's clearly absurd. Now, maybe Benatar says, oh, it's not so bad as to be a day of torture. It's much less bad. Tell me how bad it is, and then I'll make the amount of intrinsic badness, the pain, comparably less than that.
What if I say, okay, it's a pinprick, and then you can be cryogenically frozen forever? That doesn't seem like such a cactus to embrace.
Yeah, so I think that intuition can be explained away a little bit, though I admit a lot of people seem to have something like that. Francis Cam has defended somebody having a rationally permissible preference to prefer delaying their death, even when it makes no overall difference to their well-being level. One thing I think that's going on when people make these sorts of judgments is that they think, at least implicit, that there's something good for them about existence. And if there's something good for them about existence, then that's contributing positively to their well-being level. So that can't be what's going on, because then it would outweigh the pinprick. So if you think there's something good about your existence for you, then that has to be further offset by additional intrinsic badness. And then I think it does become very counterintuitive. But the other thing to say is, if the badness of annihilation is only slightly worse than a pinprick, then it's not going to do the explanatory work that Benatar wants it to do. So he wants to capture this judgment that there's something like really terrible about the death of, say, the person who's terminally ill that has no prospective good life. But if you say, well, we capture that by positing annihilation being intrinsically bad, but it's only slightly worse than a pinprick, that's not really capturing the intuition that he wants, which is that there's something deeply horrible for the person about their annihilation, one that could cause existential dread. It's not going to explain why the death of a teenager is overall worse for the teenager than the death of the baby, because the difference in the deprivational harm is much greater than that of a pinprick. Right? It's not going to explain the asymmetrical judgments about prenatal and posthumous non-existence either. Once you make the amount of intrinsic bad occurred as tiny as a pinprick or something like that, then you're suggesting that annihilation is hardly bad for you at all. It's not something that should keep us up at night, or that we should really worry about, or that's going to do the explanatory work that he uses to motivate the view.
So this is one thought I've had about this, and I feel like it's a kind of move that will delay the checkmate for a few moves. You'll probably still win in the end, but it might just make the road a little more difficult for you. And that is, what if Benatar says, actually, those other states that you say are neutral states are also intrinsically bad? You'd say, okay, so then just think of something else. But I think it would frustrate you a bit if you couldn't come up with a clean, like, intuitive case of what we're comparing death with. You know what I mean?
Yeah, to say that being cryogenically frozen or in a consciousness coma or something like that is intrinsically bad, to like have the conscious experience of a person stopped or something is intrinsically bad.
Yeah. I mean, yeah, you'd want to say, what if these other states that you're saying, to contrast it with death, like in the Diego case, it wouldn't work if you're being put, instead of dying, you're being put in another intrinsically bad state that's just as bad as death. And so suppose that Benatar said that about being cryogenically frozen or put in a coma. Then you'd need another contrast case, and I guess that you could say, okay, just think of something else. But I guess the trouble that would make for you is it would just make it harder to imagine the kind of case that would be the counterexample.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's right. I appealed to those cases because I thought they were pretty clear cases where most people aren't going to think that the person is annihilated in those cases, even if they think they are in the coma, which is unusual, even for those that have a psychological account of identity. Somebody who's cryogenically frozen, most people don't think that results in your annihilation. Right. But you're saying he could say that's intrinsically bad as well. So it wouldn't be prudent to make that choice. Right. So I guess the case that I would have to resort to with that objection is one where you exist and maintain conscious states. And I think one way to do it is where you exist and have conscious states, but they're none of them are valenced positively or negatively. So there's no pain or no pleasure, and there's no desire satisfaction or no desire thwarting. That's one that's slightly less intuitive because I think people are going to have a harder time holding fixed those details. So they might just think like, oh, but if you really exist forever and you're not in any pain, that could be good for me in a way. So you really have to be clear that given the correct account of well-being, there's no intrinsic goods and bads that are being accrued. And if you think existence is necessarily an intrinsic good, which I don't think David Benatar thinks, then that would have to be offset by pain. So you could be existing with no pleasure and in mild pain forever to offset it. So I think you're right that it would push me to these other cases that are a little bit more difficult to hold fixed the relevant variables to get the correct judgments about them, and maybe less intuitive. But I still think that that would do the argumentative work that I want it to do, even if the judgments are more controversial there. But really, what I'd like is for my interlocutor, and not just David, but any proponent of the view, to sort of spell out what they think the intrinsically good and what they think the intrinsically bad states are, and how comparably good or bad the annihilation view is. And then once we get clear on those details, it'll sort of be easier to pin down the view. Part of the reason it's hard to do that now is you have to fill in some of the gaps in the ways that the view can be made more precise, and then give variations of different thought experiments in relation to the various ways that the view could be filled out.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think that's exactly right. That your view would still win in the end. I wonder. So the Benatar annihilationism view, that's saying not that the event of death is intrinsically bad, but that the state of being dead is intrinsically bad, right?
No, I think it's saying that the event that brings about the annihilation of the person is intrinsically bad for the person
Oh, the event
rather than the
is.
state. Yeah, that's how I understand it. Rather than that the state of being dead is intrinsically bad. That might be open to interpretation. If I recall, the language that is used in Benatar's book is something like, it's just annihilation is bad in itself. So that's how I understood it. And when I fleshed out the view in that way, and David kindly gave me comments at the Rome conference, he didn't object to that formulation of the view. So I think that's the correct way to read it. But there is some ambiguity in the text itself, if I recall correctly.
Does
Are you
anything?
thinking it's more plausible if you say that the state of being dead is
No, no, no.
intrinsically
I
bad?
I thought his view was the state, and that maybe the event is more plausible, because I guess I thought that this was part of your objection, that if it was the state of being dead, then it's hard to see how you give it any bit of negative um, utility at all, then it would have to be infinite because it goes on forever. There's not like that's why it's annihilation. Like it's so it's hard to see
Yeah.
how if it's not the event, if it's the state of being dead, if it's hard to see how it could be just finitely bad, right? To be infinitely dead or dead for forever. Um,
Yeah.
so because yeah, if you took any period of time and said being annihilated for 10 years is worth negative 100 or whatever, well then it's going to be infinite. If you say, and also if you say it's negative 1 or negative zero point 0.1, it's still going to be infinite because it just never stops. So it seems like the only way you could have annihilation be finitely bad, intrinsically bad, would be to have it be the event and not the state.
Yeah. So I do say something like that in the paper because he does say at one point it's better for you to delay your annihilation. And that's confusing. If annihilation is intrinsically bad, why would it be less bad if it happens later rather than earlier? Now, if he just says it's the same degree of badness for you no matter when it happens, then that doesn't actually give you any reason to delay your death. Because if you delay it, it's just going to make the intrinsically bad thing happen later rather than earlier and not make an overall difference to how much intrinsic net good you receive over your life. Then I do say at one point, like, if he just says it's delaying it, for this long equals this much diminishment in badness, whatever you say for that, then I can just give a series of trade-off cases. Tell me what the ratio is between how much intrinsic badness you have to occur for it to be worth it to delay it for X number of years. And then to delay it an infinite amount of time, you get the view that you should incur an infinite amount of intrinsic badness to delay annihilation. And I think that's obviously absurd. Even if it's something like a pinprick every year for eternity, it doesn't have to be something like a torture every year. Even an infinite number of pinpricks spread out just to avoid annihilation but not get any additional intrinsic good, I think there's no way that could be true.
Especially if you accept like additivity, like, okay, why not? It should be worthwhile for you to have one fewer pinprick, but like get them all at once. And now you're being tortured horribly, like in your original example. Uh,
Yeah.
yeah, I'm trying to push back on you, but I just think this is I just think you're right, and I just think this is a very compelling argument. So yeah, you've convinced me. I was convinced from like the moment I heard it, and so I don't really know how to push back on it. What I forget what Benatar said. Um, how does he resist you?
Yeah. Well, so one thing that he said about the infinite case was that we could deny the additivity. You could not be just a simple aggregationist about harms. And then he thinks it's easier to bite the bullet about the case of incurring, say, an infinite number of pinpricks spread out over a long time to avoid annihilation. Another thing that he pushed back on was whether being put in a coma annihilates you and whether being cryogenically frozen annihilates you. But I couldn't, if I recall correctly, it's been a few years now, couldn't get a answer as to what he thought the necessary and sufficient conditions for avoiding annihilation were. But that might push me back to those other cases where you continue to exist with conscious states but accrue no intrinsic good or bad. And those he seems happier to bite the bullet on. He also expressed some skepticism about, again, if I recall correctly, making these sorts of trade offs. But I think you have to answer that question, right? So even if you don't have a well worked out theory about what the trade off should be, there has to be some answer to that question. Even if the answer is it's all incommensurable, but that's not going to do a lot of work on his behalf either, because saying it's all incommensurable is going to imply that it's not worse to be tortured for billions of years and then put into a consciousness coma than to just go out of existence, right? If there's no way to fill in the details that's going to avoid the absurd conclusions, then it's not going to help your view to refuse to take a stance on how to make it more precise. And I just don't see a way to make it more precise that's not going to generate some very difficult to believe conclusions. And he hasn't provided a way to work out the details. Like maybe there's some way that I'm just not seeing, but as of now, at least to me, those details remain elusive.
Let's move on to immortality. Um, there is some discussion about whether immortality would actually be a bad thing, like it would if we lived forever we wouldn't have meaningful lives or something like that, or eternity would become tedious. So I got to say, I have a particular reaction to arguments that try to argue against immortality being a good thing. One, it strikes me as very counterintuitive. Like I think we pretty much everyone instinctively thinks it would be better to keep on living, and if the life is like good in terms of well-being and stuff like that. It seems weird to think that there's any positive out of that ending at some point, like for yourself anyway. I mean, it might like take away resources from someone else or something like that, but just for oneself, it sure seems like weird to think that there's any positive to a good life not continuing to go on. And I am suspicious that attempts to show that immortality is actually in some significant way a bad thing. It's sort of like sour grapes. It's like we sort of think that we don't really have much religious hope that there's going to be an afterlife, so we're sort of resigned to the fact that we're going to die, and so there's like this psychic motivation to explain why there's actually something good about it. I suspect that's kind of an unfair psychologizing of people who take this view, and I think they're interesting variants of the view. But I have this sort of suspicion about anything I read that's like this, that tries to show that immortality is all things considered bad or something like that. I just feel like surely we all know that immortality would be great if the life is a good life, and there's this intense motivation to explain why our actual existential position isn't as bad as it seems to be.
I mean, what you said sounded almost tautological, that immortality would be great if the life is a good life. And I think everyone would agree with that. But there's different reasons that they've offered to suggest that immortality would necessarily not be a good life for creatures like us. And then some of the more nuanced arguments concern what we should do in light of our uncertainty here. So if we could be immortal and there's a chance that it'd be not great for us, and there's a chance that it would be great for us, would we be rationally permitted in taking that chance? And if so, what would determine that? And then people like Stephen Cave, who broadly fall under the banner of the so-called immortality curmudgeon. I mean, he's really concerned about whether it would be not good for the person, but like good for the world that we live in. And I mean, he's concerned about some of the moral issues that you alluded to. If we could extend our lives even for a very long time, but kept reproducing, then eventually we'd run out of resources in the world, and then that could produce like mass famine and war and all sorts of conflict and strife that would make there'd be a lot more suffering or something than there otherwise would be. The stuff that I've worked on is just about the question of whether immortality would be good for beings like us. And the claim that we could not, that there's no possible way for us to live an immortal life that we should want, is a very strong claim that I am highly skeptical of. I don't know what people's motivations are for making the arguments that they do, but I don't think that the arguments succeed. And a lot of it is rooted in Williams' sort of famous immortality curmudgeon argument, where he argues essentially that we'd be placed in a dilemma. He thinks any immortal life would result in like one of two things happening to us. Either we get to do everything that we want to do now for its own sake, basically what he calls categorical desires. And I'm not quite sure how to understand that term. There's different ways to disambiguate it, but roughly he thinks of it as like the desires that we have that are not conditional on us being alive, that motivate us to want to continue living. So, seeing my daughter Rialta graduate college or something might be a categorical desire, where other ones like drinking water if I'm thirsty, he might think I only want on the condition that I happen to continue living, and I don't want it in and of itself. I'm not sure what to make of that distinction, but he thinks like one thing that could happen is that we'd satisfy all of our categorical desires without acquiring any new ones. And then we wouldn't want to live anymore. There'd be no reason to do so. Or we would gain new categorical desires after we satisfy or give up on old ones. And at each point in our life, maybe we would want to live another day or another year or whatever. But if I'm thinking right now about whether I, Travis at 38, should want to live, 10,000 more years, and I'm imagining what my life would look like 10,000 years from now if I'm enjoying it with a completely different set of categorical desires, I'd be so different as the type of person that I am that he thinks right now I shouldn't care about turning into that type of person, either literally or figuratively, right? So if it's not literally me, then it's not immortality. But if it is me in the sense that personal identity is maintained, but the type of things that Travis 10,000 years in the future enjoys, or a million years or a billion or whatever, is so disconnected from what I know and care about now, that just doesn't give me reason to continue living in the future. I don't care about any of my kin. Maybe they're all dead at this point, depending on how we specify the details of the case. And I got sick of philosophy, and I really got into golf or something. I don't like golf, but now I'm like, a billion years from now, I'm really into golf and, learning about soil erosion or whatever. Like that just, or things, or the types of like activities now that aren't even part of our culture in this time and place. It'd be so different that I just shouldn't want to be that type of person. So that's how I understand his argument. I'm happy to say why I don't buy it, but I wanted to pause there in case you wanted to jump in with your skepticism.
Okay, so I think why the thing I said wasn't tautological is I thought, like, by good life, I meant good life in terms of well-being, and sometimes people distinguish between meaning and well-being as components of the good life. So I thought that a lot of the threat to the goodness of a life that's supposed to come from immortality was on the well-being side of it. But excuse me, on the meaning side of it, not the well-being side of it. But it seems weird to think like it can experience machine life. I would go along with Nozick in thinking that a life in an experience machine where there aren't other like avatars of people in there with you. You're in there alone. I do have the strong intuition that isn't the optimal life that one could live. And so I would say I would reject hedonism for that reason. But that doesn't require me to say that an experience machine life is less than zero. It's not worth living at all. So I could imagine someone who is in an experience machine, and suppose that what Bernard Williams says is true, and they've played it all out and they've done everything they've wanted to do. Well, why not just, and then you could either like press an extinction button and that's it, you're gone, or you could press a reset button and it would wipe your brain clean, and then you just do it all over again. You don't have any memories, so you're not bored. Why wouldn't you just keep pressing the reset button, right? I don't see why not. And the other thing I want to say is it's just so silly to say. So, granting this distinction between the categorical desires, I just think there's this massive status quo bias that's going on here with like you don't have categorical desires for the next 1,000 years because you're not intending to live for that long. But if you were able to live that long, you probably would. You would want to be there for your daughter's 900th birthday or whatever. I guess I would have all sorts of things. Like I would want to see, like, actually, I have thought. It's sad that I don't, because I'm really interested in history, and I'm not going to get to know what happens, in the 1,000 years in the next century. I would definitely I would immediately form a bunch of new categorical desires as soon as that were possible. Anyway, those are some reactions I have to what you just said.
Yeah, good. So with respect to Williams, I think the point of us having different categorical desires if we knew we were going to live forever is true. But I think he would just say that nevertheless we'll have a finite set, and that finite set is going to be exhaustible, because each categorical desire will be exhaustible. Now you might question that. You might just say like, no, I have a categorical desire to spend time with my family and friends, and that as much time as possible, so that will never be exhaustible. I'll never get sick of spending time with them. Or I have a categorical desire to try to make the world a better place, and as long as the world is suboptimal and there's something that I can do about it, then that's a categorical desire that's not exhaustible. And maybe satisfying it would be meaningful. He sort of talks about meaning sometimes in terms of having these projects that derive from your categorical desires. John Martin Fisher has argued that some so-called base pleasures are ones that we would not get sick of, and we could have a categorical desire to satisfy those. So hunger, thirst, sex, or something like that. That would be something that you could engage in indefinitely, he thinks. Anytime you're thirsty, it'll feel good to drink water, and so on. Like one way to push back against Williams is to argue that we have even if we have a finite set of categorical desires, that some of them will be inexhaustible. And that might be because we could engage in them forever without getting bored. Another thing that's related to what you were saying is that I mean, we might be willing to engage in them forever because memory fades. I mean, maybe we get bored doing something in short succession. But if we have enough of a break in between those, then we could rotate through satisfying various categorical desires and then always sort of circle back to one after a long enough time has passed.
Surely you've had the experience of like there's some album you used to enjoy, you haven't listened to it for 10 years, and you listen and it's like, oh, it's new again. The neurons are
Yeah.
now sensing novelty again because it's been so long. So
Yeah.
yeah, it would be something like that.
That's right. In fact, I not only have had that experience, but one chapter in the book that I'm working on, Death, is to say there's another problem with Williams here, which is we can imagine that our psychology works differently. So I think that is how our psychology works. But even if it didn't, even if our categorical desires were narrow enough that we would have to keep engaging in this to the point where we would, in fact, get bored with it, he's not holding other things fixed, right? So he's imagining that our memories are at least good enough to retain enough of this information to be bored again. He's imagining that we stop aging biologically, but not chronologically. So when he's setting up the thought experiment, he's holding certain features of us fixed, but not others. And if he's making the strong claim that he is, there's no justification for holding fixed this supposed fact about our psychology, that we would get bored in engaging in this if we lived forever. We could be psychologically constituted slightly differently, such that we enjoy listening to that album over and over and over again, no matter how short a time has passed between it, or watching a movie, or hanging out with friends, or having philosophical conversation, and so on. And surely I think that would be good for us. And if there is such a thing as meaning, that would be meaningful too. There is some skepticism, to your point, about meaning. What you said about the experience machine and the reset button is interesting. So let me just say first, like, I'm a meaning skeptic. I don't think there's any such thing as meaning in life. And really, all of the things that we want to call meaningful, we could talk profitably of in terms of moral and prudential value. I just want to explain away any meaningful thing in terms of either moral or prudential value, and not say that there's this third category here that like might be good for you in some way, or if it's not enhancing your well-being, it's still like giving you reason to live. I find that baffling. But the other thing to say about that is this is a point of disagreement. So there's a great paper called Living Life Over Again, where Blumenfeld argues that if you were given the option for sort of Nietzschean eternal recurrence, where like you live out your life and then you can either go out of existence or hit the reset button, as you put it, where the whole like world starts again. He thinks one reason it would be rationally permissible to not choose to go around another time and another time and another time is because your life would lack meaning the second, third, fourth time around, so to speak, even if it's good for your well-being. So what he calls Tallier's reason as follows, and I'm a Tallier, I think. My life has been good on the whole. There's been positive and negatives, but the positive has outweighed the even at times very serious negatives. So if it's good for me on the whole, and then I do it again, it'll be good for me on the whole again, and then again and again and so on. So it'd be imprudent not to make that choice. And one reason that he thinks it's rationally permissible to not go around again is because the second, third, fourth time that you live your life thinks it's not containing meaning. It's only containing well-being. And that an absence of meaning is a sufficient reason to not choose to live again.
But what if I said the meaning of this life is that it is an echo of the decisions I once made? I mean, if the first one, if you've got meaningfulness in the first one, there's some connection there with the subsequent iterations, right? Maybe it's less meaningful, but it does seem like, yeah, this is an echo of the decisions I made. That does seem like once you've got meaningfulness there, I don't see why it would go away. It would not be as meaningful in the second one, and I actually don't see why there would be any kind of like diminishing, like, asymptotic decline of like each life getting less meaningful after the first one. I think it's okay. It makes sense to say the second one and all of the next ones are somewhat less meaningful, but I'd still think the connection with the first life would still give some meaning to each of them.
Yeah. So, I mean, I think part of his thought is anything that you've accomplished in your first life is something that means you're not going to accomplish anything the second, third, and fourth iteration because you've done it before. So would co-authoring, like, is morality real? If it's your, nth time of doing it, would that add meaning to your life? Spencer, he's going to say, no, you already wrote the book. Writing it again isn't going to add any more meaning. You're not accomplishing anything new by writing it a second and third and fourth time, even though it seems to you like it's the first time that you're writing it. And he gives a interesting thought experiment. I hope I'm remembering the details correctly, but it's something like, suppose that you're a mathematician and you know that you don't have long left to live, and you just solved some very complicated mathematical proof. It was a great accomplishment. And you can either take a drug that induces amnesia, like short-term amnesia, so you don't remember the work that you did there, and then you can solve it again before you die. Or you cannot take the drug, and then you could engage in solving some, more basic, less impressive proofs. And suppose you'll enjoy doing that less than the amount of enjoyment you'd get from solving the more complicated one. He thinks like it's totally rational, to prudentially rational to choose the lesser proofs, because he thinks that would add, I guess, more meaning overall to your life.
I thought he was just
Rather
going
than
to say,
doing
go to
time.
go to the beach or go to the movies and celebrate. I mean, that's what I would do if I've accomplished something. I'd celebrate.
Yeah.
Yeah. Uh, yeah. Rather than like, let me do it again. So yeah, I guess I do share that intuition. There's an article in your anthology here. I think it's by David Beglin, that is kind of a response to Williams on this, and he says, okay, um, Williams might be wrong, but there's something in the vicinity that he's right about. And I thought that was actually one of my favorite entries into this anthology.
So, like, one question we can ask is, you know, would some type of immortality be good for creatures like us? And I think the answer to that question is like, yes, very, very clearly, yes. I don't get the degree of influence that Williams' argument has had in the literature. I'm sort of surprised at how many people seem to accept such a strong conclusion. Even my students, I teach at a Catholic school, so presumably most of them believe in an afterlife, or if you just survey people in the US, generally most of them believe in afterlife. But even when I cover Williams with my students, it seems like almost half of them seem convinced by his argument, though they don't seem to have existential dread that they're going to then apparently suffer an eternally bad fate. So I'm not sure what's going on there. Right. So that's one question. And then I think there's a way to like work out pretty clearly that Williams is wrong. But another more nuanced question we might ask is to take a step back and say, suppose we're faced with the choice of immortality and we're not certain about whether it's going to be good or bad for us. And like, what should we do in that case? And I think of David Beglin's article as sort of falling within that more nuanced question. Now, are you thinking? Well, let me ask you this: why don't you think, if we think it's probably good for us, we should just choose it? Like, we could be wrong, but if it's more likely that we're right than we're wrong, which isn't the obvious answer, that we should just choose immortality?
Yeah, that seems right. If given a choice and it might be bad, but it's more likely to be good, we should choose the good one. You're going to tell me why I'm wrong about that?
Well, I know, I think that's right, although it's hard to justify from a decision theoretic point. So this actually gets beyond what is in the Beglin article, but it's related to both the Beglin and the Gorman article in that anthology. It's like one decision procedure is to just maximize expected value, but that clearly can't be the right decision procedure to use when we are deciding whether to live an immortal life. And one reason it's not right, and this is in the Gorman, not the Beglin, is if you're choosing between two, like, say, there's two doors in front of you, and they'll both lead to like immortal life. One of them, 100% chance immortal life right away. The other, it's like a 0.1% chance of an immortal life and a 99.9% chance of death. The expected value is going to be the same positive infinite amount. So then it would entail that you should be prudentially indifferent between those two choices, but it seems clearly if you care about your well-being, that you should go through the door that guarantees immortality, then almost certainly you're going to just die rather than get that sort of infinite good.
Pascal's
Another reason
wager
to be,
kind of problem.
yeah. I mean, and another reason, and this gets closer to the Beglin, is you might think that there's a reason to be, I don't know how to put it, like more conservative in your choices, or like take a safe bet where you give greater weight to avoiding intrinsic bad than accruing intrinsic good. So if there's even a small chance that immortality would be infinitely bad for you, even if there's like a greater chance that it'd be infinitely good, you might want to give greater weight to avoiding the infinite badness rather than just automatically taking the risk for infinite good. As a thought experiment that moves beyond the anthology, imagine that you could spin a roulette wheel, and if you get like numbers 1 through, I don't know, say it's a wheel with 100 on it. If you get numbers 1 through 99, you get a year of good life. And if you hit 100, then you get 98 years of really bad life. So then the chance that you get bad life, it's like 1 in 100, and the badness it would be 98 that negative, or 99 times 1 year of good life. Maximizing expected value in that finite case means you should spin the wheel. But I think a lot of people think it's probably prudentially rational to say, no, thanks, I'm not going to take that bet at all. I'm not going to spin the wheel. I don't want to risk having I don't want to risk having 99 years of terrible existence to just very likely get 1 additional good year of existence. I do think that's wrong. I don't see any principled way to justify these sorts of judgments. So I think we should actually bite the bullet and just follow the math in that case. And we should be, sort of risk neutral there. But that is to try to sort of motivate the view that there's a interesting argument to be made in the vicinity of Williams, that maybe we should be cautious about trying to make ourselves immortal if we are risk adverse in this way.
Interesting. Right. Yes, that's right. But typically when people try to be immortal, they're just trying to extend their lives, their finite lives, for as long as possible. I think the danger of people like in the real world actually pursuing immortality, I guess, would be that this is a vain hope and like you're wasting your finite amount of time. There's a theme that comes up in the story of the man who did not wish to die in the anthology that suggests that there's something like wicked in the desire. Like it's a more somehow a morally defective desire to want to live forever, right? Like if you're wise, you'll content yourself with just a normal human lifespan or something like that. And I don't know. So one reason? I mean, it might be bad to hope for immortality. Would be immortality isn't actually good, or immortality includes a significant risk of badness, might not be good given what we know. But another objection you might have to that kind of a desire is that no, immortality would be really good, but there's something hubristic in thinking that you should have that kind of a good or something like that. It's too godlike. It's not appropriate for mortals, and there's something wrong about wanting that.
Right. So to your first point, it's true that actual attempts to engage in serious life extension or immortality are seem to be almost invariably ones where people could end their lives if they wanted to. So then there's not that danger that you get in the thought experiment that I considered. And then as to whether there's something like hubristic about wanting to live forever, or appealing to metaphors that some have, like that's like having a great dinner and getting great luxury and then saying, I should get more of that, an infinite amount, even, that there seems to be something objectionable about that. I just don't see a good argument for that view, period. And the analogies that are drawn are ones where I think a lot of background assumptions are motivating those judgments. So about a meal or something, you might just think, well, there's plausibly like finite resources and there's people that are hungry in the world, and obviously eating more is not going to feel good after a while. You'll feel sick or something. But that's not going to be analogous to wanting more good life. The more good life would necessarily be good for you. That's what you want. You don't want bad life. You want more life that's good. The desire is not coming at the expense of anybody else's well-being or finite resources. It's just a desire for possibility that is not going to obtain. And I have a hard time seeing what's objectionable about that, because it doesn't involve putting yourself above other existing people or thinking of yourself as more important or taking away resources. So I just think there's a lot of things that we have to be very careful for when we think about this as an analogy to other things that are supposedly objectionable. And once we clear those things away, I just don't see any argument for what's supposed to be problematic about having that desire for infinite good life.
So there's some people who think, like, look, one of the worst disease in the world maybe is aging. That our bodies get worn down over the course of our lifetimes. I guess our telomeres get shorter, they get frayed or something as we live. I'm not sure exactly about the biology of this, but if we ought to be like prudentially and maybe morally, we ought to be investing like enormous amounts of resources into curing aging. The reason we don't think of it as a disease is just this kind of status quo bias. We just sort of assume that it is natural. It's the way of the world. But there are all sorts of things that are natural and yet, bad, and we should want to improve them if we can. So maybe we should just think of aging like this as something it wouldn't be immortality in the sense like you could still die in a car crash or something like that, but you wouldn't die of old age. That's something that we should be like heavily investing in, trying to make happen.
Right. Okay, good. So I think it's worth distinguishing between the desire that a lot of people have, where they just think like, I wish I didn't have to die and I wish I could live a good life forever. And then this claim that we should be using our finite resources in our society to try to cure aging rather than all the other things we could be doing with those resources. I think there's some argument to be made that the latter is objectionable in a way that's not going to bear on the former. Is it objectionable, though? I mean, I think I take it that the argument is something like, well, there's a lot more immediate, more easily solvable problems that we could be spending our time on, such that it's objectionable or wrong or something to spend it on an anti-aging process. I think that could be true. I don't know if it's going to be true by many people's lights who make that argument. There's lots of other things that people think are permissible to spend time and resources on, like trying to cure different types of cancer, or going on vacation with one's family, or sitting at home and reading a book to engage in some intellectual inquiry, or pursuing one's artistic projects. That is just not going to be nearly as valuable as trying to cure aging is going to be. So if these other things are okay to do, and they're worse than trying to cure aging is, then I think aging has to also be okay. If we want to go full, you should be trying to maximize overall good, then maybe there's a case to be made that we should be spending it on trying to end factory farming or eradicate global poverty, or maybe just do things like help people avoid heart disease, where we know how to do that, and it's just a matter of putting the resources in to make that happen. And I'm actually sympathetic to those types of arguments. I just think most of the people that make the argument about the anti-aging case are not going to be sympathetic to giving this full maximization of the good argument.
No, but you see, Travis, like we're going to make Peter Singer live forever, and so it's going to be conducive to, he'll be around to make the arguments against factory farming for the next, however many decades until we're finally wise enough to abolish it.
Well, if we could make Peter Singer immortal, I would get behind that. My philosophical disagreements notwithstanding, that would be a wonderful contribution to the philosophical community.
So Bagelin has got this article that says something like, there's a risk that immortality would be bad. Actually, it's been a while since I've read it. I taught this in the fall, and I haven't looked at it again, so my memory here might be hazy. But it's something like the worry would be, if you had an infinite amount of time, an infinite number of opportunities there's no pressing reason for you to take anything right now, right? Like the finiteness of our time, the opportunity costs make this meaningful. Like I'm here having this conversation with you. It's like I could be at home with my family, I could be working on my book, I could be reading something. There are all these other valuable things I could be doing, and you might think that the measure of my investment in this experience is what I choose to give up in order to have it. And if you've got an infinite number of opportunities to do the same thing, there's no opportunity cost for anything, then making a similar choice, like choosing to do this, doesn't come at any kind of cost to me, um, right? Because I haven't given anything up. I can go do those things later, and that's going to be true for everything. I'm just riffing, I guess, on Beckman. I don't remember if this is his actual exact argument, but reading the article has inspired me to like make something like this argument, and then the result being like we have a life in which nothing meaningful happens. I know you're a skeptic of meaning, but for those of us who are more open to it, you might find that there's something troubling about that. Even if you're not a meaning skeptic, you might think there's something just psychologically troubling that we wouldn't enjoy events as much if we knew that they didn't come at the cost of anything else. Like there might even be a hedonic dimension to it.
Yeah. Right. I mean, I think there's different versions of this argument. So one can be run in terms of meaningfulness, and another can be run in terms of goodness. And you just might think we wouldn't be motivated to do things that are going to produce well-being because we could always do it at a later time. And there's different responses to give to them. Some of them overlap. So with the meaningfulness one, I mean, one thing to say is you can imagine worlds where you live forever, but the opportunity to engage in certain meaningful activities are limited. And some of them might be mutually exclusive. So I hope that your podcast runs forever. But it could be the case that we live in a world where we have infinite lives, but you're only going to do your podcast for a finite amount of time, and then you're going to move on to other projects. So maybe you have the opportunity to come on your podcast and talk about the philosophy of death, or the opportunity to go do something else that's going to be a one-time thing, or that's only available for a finite amount of time, and I might not be able to do both. And then I still am going to have to make choices about how to structure the meaningful activities that I do in my life. Now, maybe there'll be other meaningful activities that I could engage in later, but if you don't think that meaningful activities are fungible, and people that tend to believe in meaningfulness tend to think that they're not just fungible, you just don't count up the units of meaningfulness, and then you can trade them for one another. Should think that we can face this sort of dilemma in our lives, and there can be sort of scarce resources about the token activities of meaningfulness that we could engage in that could motivate us in the ways that are similar to the lives that we have now. I mean, another thing is, like, you gave this example of being in an experience machine, but we could imagine this kind of Nietzschean eternal recurrence where we don't know that we're living forever. Maybe we in fact do, and maybe we accrue infinite well-being and infinite meaningfulness. But if we're ignorant of that fact and we think that we have a finite amount of time, or even if we think that it's, quite probable that we have a finite amount of time, that could impose those sorts of choices on us as well, right? So maybe we are 99% confident or whatever that we're immortal, but we think there's a 1% chance that we could make some choice to do something that's going to result in the end of our lives. And that risk still imposes those sorts of constraints. Questions about being motivated to do stuff to either accrue meaning or well-being are slightly different. So suppose like you are going to live forever and you only get to do one thing that's going to bring you some intrinsic good. So let's just say it's like open a bottle of wine and enjoy a glass of wine. You could do it today, but there's no reason to do it today because you could do it tomorrow. And if you do it tomorrow, then it'll be just as good then. Or if you do it 10,000 years from now, it'll be just as good then, and so on. But if each day you decide not to do it because you will have the opportunity at some point in the future, then you never do it, and that's worse for you. All right. So you might think, well, if we lived forever, we wouldn't be motivated to do anything, and then we would in fact accrue no well-being and no meaning because we will always be putting it off when we could do it later. And I think, this is an interesting idea, but it's just not how we in fact work, especially because we're temporally biased. we prefer all else equal goods sooner rather than later in terms of personal time. And that temporal bias, even if it's irrational, if we're acting on it, it would solve this problem. It would result in us having lives where we do things that will enhance our meaning, if there is such a thing, and our well-being. A different rational agent, something might be presented with this puzzle with a different motivational structure, but that's not going to apply to humans. And for those different agents, just pick a random day to drink the bottle of wine, and it'll make no difference. But as you only have to make one choice, which is to drink it rather than to not drink it. As long as you make that choice, then you'll be better off. The last thing I'll say is it gets more complicated. It turns into a paradox when the bottle of wine increases. That's why it's like a wine example in the ever-aging wine case. Suppose each day you wait, it becomes twice as tasty as it would have been the day before.
Or just the fact of you're waiting, the greater the anticipation, the better it gets. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And then there's an interesting puzzle about when you should open it, if at all. Because each day if you just waited one more day, it'd be twice as good because the anticipation would be greater or it would have aged better. But if you always wait, then you never drink it and then you're worse off as a result. So, but that's an interesting puzzle, but one that doesn't apply to whether some type of immortal life would be good for us.
Right. One example Beglin gives, I think, or maybe this is an elaboration of something he says, is there's certain goods that seem like if you had too many of them, it would not be as good, right? Like you can't have 600 best friends, it seems.
Yeah. Doesn't he use the example of the film Her to try to illustrate that point?
I don't remember if he did or if I also thought of that, but yeah. But I was just thinking about that in connection with Beglin, which is the movie Her with Joaquin Phoenix, and he has this relationship with this AI, and she says she's in a relationship with like hundreds of other people, but that doesn't change how she feels about him. And I always thought that that actually might be true from her perspective. Like a mind like that might be able to be in a meaningful relationship with that many people at the same time, but that doesn't compute for human psychology. I would assume though that even for some, I forget what the name of the AI character is. Scarlett Johansson does the voice. I assume there would have to be some upper threshold for even an AI like that. But the thought is like if there are goods like this, and maybe friendship is just one of them, where there have to be trade-offs. You can't have an infinite number of best friends. You can't have an infinite number of people you're married to, whatever. Then that might bolster the argument that a finite life is necessary for us to have certain kind of goods to the extent that we have them.
Yeah. So let me just say, I like David Beglin's work a lot, and it's some of the best stuff, in my opinion, on the desirability of immortality. But I am skeptical about this argument as well. So one thing to say is, even if this is true that there'd be a loss in being able to obtain these types of goods, if we're able to obtain other goods in an infinite life, then that's just going to be better for us. As long as those goods have some non-zero value that doesn't diminish to the point where we can't accrue an infinite amount. Right? So as long as it's not like each subsequent time or something, they're half as good so that it approaches a finite limit. As long as there's a non-zero value to the other types of goods and they don't diminish in a way where we can accrue an infinite amount of them, it's just going to be better for us. Infinitely better. You could say, giving up on relationships is really, really bad, but drinking water when you're thirsty adds a little bit of good. And if you get an infinite amount of that, that's just going to be the infinitely better choice for you. And that's what you should do in those cases. The other thing to say is her example in the cases of romantic relationships are ones where we're psychologically and socially constituted to want to be in monogamous or semi-monogamous relationships because of jealousy and being ostracized by society and so on if you're not. And so that, I think, colors people's judgments about the example that comes from the film Her. And there's also something where the AI wasn't being dishonest, but Joaquin Phoenix was oblivious to the fact that she was simultaneously seemingly forming deep friendships, some platonic, some not, with many people like at the same time that he was talking with her was jarring for him. But I just don't see why we should think that those relationships are less special or less valuable just because they're numerous. Right? I can see why it would make sense for people to deliberately choose to engage in monogamous relationships in the time and place in which we live, given their psychology, right? But I don't see why for AIs, like Scarlett Johansson's character, that the value of the relationships that she was engaged in were diminished even in the slightest, just because they were more numerous. And I don't see that with friendship either. Why can't you have an infinite number of best friends? And if you're not going to be jealous and it's not going to detract from the relationship, why couldn't you have an infinite number of romantic partners where they're all equally valuable, or even different degrees of value, but they add overall value to it? I just don't see what the argument is going to be for that claim. And yeah, I'll say one last thing about this. My favorite Black Mirror episode is the San Junipero one, which is a cliche choice, I know, but it's so good. And that episode revolves around two people that essentially have the ability to go into an experience machine with each other, where rather than being very elderly, they would be in their like younger version of themselves and then get to live forever. And one of the women is concerned that this would eradicate the value of the relationship that she had with her now deceased husband, because that was a long for normal human life, but finite amount. And if she gives that up, or I mean, if she, rather than dying, enters into this eternal relationship with another woman, then the amount of time that she'd be in that meaningful relationship would just completely, it would just be infinitely long compared to some finite amount. And she thinks that would, she expresses worry that that would lessen the value of the time that she had with her husband. I just don't like the intrinsic value of that's not going to be changed. And I don't see why we should care about the comparable value. So the intrinsic value is going to be the same. I don't see why we should want that to be the most valuable thing in your life rather than one of the least valuable things.
So I think the reason would be you're not just thinking about the total amount of value in your life, you're thinking about your life narrative. And if you're spending a million years in an experience machine with someone else, you've demoted this person who you thought of as your life partner to a footnote, as in a prelude to your million years of experience machine existence with someone else. That's not necessarily true, because you might think that that period was in a more formative time in your life, but I think that would be the kind of thought that would motivate that worry.
Yeah. I mean, I think that's right, that's the thought that motivates the worry. I have a hard time seeing why you should be concerned about making what seems like what is a very valuable relationship comparably less valuable. I don't know what it means exactly to be a footnote, but I mean, it's going to be comparably like far, 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 far less valuable. But I just don't see why that is a reason against doing it.
I think you just might be insensitive to meaning, appeals to meaning. I think that
Yeah.
might be it. About the her example, so Scarlett Johansson's character's name is Samantha. So I think the point that I got from that. So Samantha, I think you are right that there's no reason intrinsically to think like someone couldn't have that many like deep meaningful relationships once we remove the limitations of human psychology. I thought the problem that was fundamental here was that friends need to be equals of a sort, and they need to be able to empathize with each other in a certain sort of way, and or especially people in a romantic relationship. And I thought that the issue with that was that Theodore couldn't couldn't possibly empathize with Samantha. He couldn't possibly imagine being someone who is simultaneously carrying on close, like intense conversations with 600 people who are close friends at the same time. So I was thinking that that was like the beginning of the rift, and it didn't have anything to do with these other extrinsic features you were talking about.
That's really interesting. That sounds very plausible to me, and I like that reading. I should rewatch that movie. I rarely do rewatch films, and I haven't seen that since it came out. But yeah, I really like that as a reading of the movie. But then I want to know, like, is this view about friendship true? And I'd want to know why would friends have to be able to empathize with each other? Why would they have to be equals in this way?
I don't know. I don't have a defense of it immediately. I mean, you could say like maybe our concept of friendship would have to evolve if we're confronted with radically different kinds of minds. I do have a hard, you know, thinking of like, yeah, like it just seemed like when I'm with a friend, I'm thinking about like they're gonna enjoy hearing about this story. They're gonna, I don't know. I'm always sort of putting myself in their shoes during interactions, and if friendship would have to be redefined in a pretty radical way, I think, where we're enjoying each other, we know that we're enjoying each other's company, or choosing to be in each other's company, but neither of us can really know what the person is thinking in a really fundamental way. There probably are people who would be okay with that. Maybe there's nothing wrong with that, but it does seem like something has been lost there.
Yeah, I mean, that's interesting. I mean, as I recall when I watched it, I just thought like, yeah, of course this character is going to react in this way, but it's irrational. He shouldn't. Why is something lost? I don't understand what specifically he would want out of that relationship with the AI that he's not getting. I mean, obviously the AI is going to be way more intelligent than him. He has to know that he can't fully grasp what its mind is like. And it's not like engaging in conversations with other people simultaneously is going to detract from the AI's ability from Samantha's ability to pay attention to what's Joaquin Phoenix's character's name again?
Theodore.
Oh, Theodore, right. Right. It's not like Samantha talking to other people simultaneously is going to take away her ability to pay attention to Theodore. It's just he couldn't do the same thing. He doesn't have the ability to engage in multiple conversations without detracting from his ability to pay attention to Samantha.
It
Um,
underscores the point, though. It underscores the point that, like, what really can you give a person? Like, you want to be able to give and receive certain kinds of benefits, and it seems um, like I don't know. I could give you helpful advice on philosophical stuff you're thinking, and you could reciprocate. But if one of us was like a supercomputer or something like that, like, what can I add? How can I help you realize your aims? You can help me realize mine. How can I really help you realize yours? And I don't know. I don't. And if you ask, well, why should that be necessary for friendship? I'm not sure I would know what to say at the moment, but I think it seems to be. I think it's friendships are valuable, like in that you're not just enjoying each other, but you're feeling like you're useful, like you're contributing something, helping someone out with their projects, and it's like you just with a certain kind of psychological distance, like that might not be possible anymore.
yeah, I've never felt useful in any friendship. No, I mean, that's interesting, but I wonder, like, I don't know. It seems to me like I've had friends, and I think I've been friends with people where it's just like we enjoyed each other's company, and that's it. I don't know what having aims amounts to, but I don't think I've had friendships and been a friend in the sense where I've merely making time spent with somebody more enjoyable than it otherwise would be, and there's no additional goals or aims or things that I'm helpful with beyond that sort of bare enjoyable time together. Uh, Now, maybe those are less valuable friends in a way. Maybe people tend to not be as close to one another in those types of friendships as ones where you are helpful or you are helping achieve aims or something. But they still seem like friendships and valuable friendships to me, nonetheless.
Well, theater could still have, you could be right, but theater could still have the rational preference that a relationship is going to be one where he can, contribute in a certain way, in the way I was sort of describing.
But I mean, the difference in cognitive abilities is going to result in all sorts of other things that might be better. Like the AI might be able to understand, like Samantha, the AI might be able to understand him better than any finite cognitive human would be able to.
Yeah, that's true.
Um,
That's true.
they might, yeah.
I'm afraid, Travis, I have got to go. I've got another commitment, like right now.
I'll
I
let you
like
go then. Thanks so much for having me. It was a pleasure.
it's always a pleasure. Yeah, I think we couldn't make a bad podcast if we wanted to, and I really like yeah, I really like the shift into the friendship as a digression. So anyway, thank you for coming, and I'll be looking forward to having you again.
Thanks. Likewise. Have a good day.